Hi, everyone, and welcome to Progressive Christian Voices, today and tomorrow. My name is Brian Elaine. I'm the founder of Compassionate Christianity and Writing for Your Life. It's a pleasure to host this series of prominent progressive Christian authors, all of whom have been published by Broadleaf Books or other 1517 media imprints, including Fortress Press and Beaming Books. So today is the final webinar in this series of four that we've had this month. But we also plan to have additional webinars in January, so stay tuned to hear more about those. We'll announce the dates and the speakers down the road. So joining us today are Angela Denker, Jennifer Farmer, and Carl McColman. Angela Denker is a Lutheran pastor and veteran journalist. She's written for many publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and Fortune magazine. Angela has appeared on CNN, BBC, and Sky News to share her research on politics and Christian nationalism in the United States. Her book, Red State Christians, Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump, was the 2019 Silver Forward Indies Award winner for political and social sciences. Jennifer R. Farmer, also known as the PR Whisperer, is a writer, trainer, and activist communicator. She's the author of First and Only, How Black Women Navigate Work and Life, and also Extraordinary PR, Ordinary Budget, a Strategy Guide. She's the host of the award-winning United Methodist Women's podcast, Faith Talks, where she interviews women of faith on their commitment to social justice. Her work has appeared in publications such as The Blavity, Society for Nonprofits, Chronicle of Philanthropy, CNN, The Root, HuffPost, LifeJack, PR Daily, and the Red Letter Christians. Jennifer is the founder of Spotlight PR, a boutique firm specializing in communication strategy and training for leaders and groups committed to social and racial justice. Carl McColeman is a contemplative writer, speaker, teacher, soul friend, and storyteller. He's the author of numerous books, including The Big Book of Christian Mysticism, Answering the Contemplative Call, and Unteachable Lessons. His latest book, Eternal Heart, was published in the summer of 2021, and Carl's book, Befriending Silence, won the 2015 Georgia Author of the Year Award in the field of inspirational religious writing. Brian McLaren says, if you don't know about Carl McColman and his work, you should. That's a great endorsement. Carl's writing appears on numerous websites, including Pathos, Huffington Post, Day One, Contemplative Life, and The Medium. Carl co-hosts the Encountering Silence podcast with filmmaker Cassidy Hall and theologian Kevin Johnson. So to all three of you, thank you so much for being here with us. I'm really excited to be able to share some time speaking with you. So thanks so much.
Good to be here.
This evening, I'm going to be asking the panelists several questions. But if any of the attendees would like to ask a question, that's perfectly fine. The best way to do that is to type it into the Q&A function in the Zoom portal, and I'll relay that to our speakers. So maybe we can each start by having each of you tell us a little bit about your most recent book. And let's go in the order that I did the introductions, which is the same of alphabetical order by your last name. Sorry. So Angela, why don't you talk a little bit about yours? I mean, that certainly had a big impact pretty broadly in these days.
Yeah, my book, Red State Christians, came out in August of 2019. And of course, the entire world has shifted on its axis since August of 2019. So the good news is that Broadleaf is we're putting out a new edition of Red State Christians that's coming out next fall to sort of look at the American Christian political landscape, not only the research that I did throughout 2018, which involved traveling across the country, interviewing Christians in red states and red counties, Christian leaders, some of these trends of militaristic Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. But then this new edition is going to factor in these important events in this political ideology and in American Christianity that have continued to veer towards religious nationalism and Trumpism. So I'm going to be looking at specifically George Floyd. I live only 3 miles away from where George Floyd was killed, and the movement for racial justice and the backlash movement to that within white Christian nationalism. I'm going to be looking at COVID and the ways that COVID has really forced Christians to come face to face with what does it really mean for us to be pro-life, and the callousness with which many Christians have dealt with the loss of hundreds of thousands of American lives to COVID, and how we've prioritized economic gains over human life. And then finally, the January 6th insurrection and the violent attempt at really an overthrow of American democracy that was very much shaped by these same trends that I first researched in Red State Christians, and how we see religious ideology being militarized on the right, on the political right in America, and continue to be shaped by, I'm with you tonight from my church, which is in rural America. I'm surrounded by Trump signs. And so very much part of what I'm living also in my ministry.
Wow. Well, that's really going to be powerful, Angela. And I'm so glad that you're continuing that work. To shine a light on some of this incredible dysfunction that's going on with our country is just ridiculous. But, helping people understand what's going on that may not know at the level that, you're researching, I think is really, really important. So thank you very much for that. And we'll talk more about, some of these issues later.
Thank you.
So Jennifer, how about you?
Sure. So thanks for creating space for this conversation. So as you shared at the outset, I'm a social justice publicist, and I'm also an author who thinks critically about issues of race, gender, religion, and also leadership. And I wrote First and Only, A Black Woman's Guide to Thriving at Work and in Life, to document what it's like to show up in different spaces as the first and the only, or the first or the only. And what I realize is that Black women who show up as the first or the only, they're celebrated in some quarters, and then they're viewed with skepticism in others. And so within the community, people may feel like, oh, this person has achieved great milestones. Think about someone like a Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris. There was a ton of celebration. But the underbelly of that celebration is that, when you are the first and only, you are held to different standards. You are always striving. You never get to the point as a Black woman where you can let your guard down. You're always fighting. You're always pushing. And so I wanted to capture that dynamic. And I wanted to write a book that spoke specifically to the experiences of Black women. A lot of times with Christian books and also with leadership books, Black women and other people of color, we're told to find ourselves through the eyes of someone else who has not walked our path. And so that can be very isolating. You can wonder, you can read all these books. I have a ton of books behind me. You can consume this content and think, okay, once I'm finished, I've arrived, only to walk into different spaces or to enter different spaces and be questioned about how you style your hair, how you present, what you wear, how you rear your children, the conversations that you choose to have or that you don't choose to have. And I wanted to name that explicitly. I also wanted to say that one of the things that makes this nation unique is when we all show up as our authentic selves and bring our authentic voices. And by bringing First and Only, by offering this work, what I wanted to say is there's space in the Christian tradition, there's space in leadership traditions to hear from authors who are different, to hear from authors who are willing to say, this is what it's like to be me. And so my audience for First and Only, first it was Black women, and then it was women of faith. And then, another audience was people who want to know more. And sometimes, it's difficult to have these conversations. And so I wanted to offer readers an inside look. First and Only came out in February of 2021. It will also be released via paperback version in the fall of 2022. I'm very excited about that.
So you're another COVID, book launch, veteran. I mean, which, I always feel a lot of empathy with folks, that had to do that. And, that's why I started all the book interviews that, we did one of, when your book came out, because it's like, can't do book tours, can't do book signings, can't travel. I mean, all these kinds of things, right? That you would normally be doing as an author to get the word out. So, I want to help try to support that as best I can. And, since you do so much work with other social justice folks too, we need to follow up with, some other things that I'm doing and chat a little bit about, potentially additional ways to collaborate. So, but thank you, Jennifer, for your work and for joining us. And so, Carl, how about you?
Well, I'm just in awe of both Angela and Jennifer, and I feel like I'm sitting at the table with the cool kids right now. My book is written, forgive me for using a cliche, but I think both of you have these wonderful kind of Martha statements, and my book is more of a Mary book. Eternal Heart is written out of my own kind of lifelong interest in the mystical and contemplative tradition within Christianity. I'm following after Karl Rahner, the German theologian, who said about 50 or 60 years ago, the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist. And that's a statement that many people find kind of confounding, but I think we see the shadow side of that right now, in terms of we see kind of the collapse of institutional Christianity, and certainly how younger people have, really rejected the nationalism within Christianity, the sexism, the homophobia, the transphobia, the many ways in which Christianity is entrenched with systems of privilege. So, so there is certainly we live in a time, as the late Phyllis Tickle said, we are on the verge of another Reformation. And I think she was really on the money.
Definitely.
And so, writing again as somebody who I'm not a monk, but I'm formed out of the monastic tradition. And so my book is really a book about the invitation to the pause, the invitation to that kind of silent place that each one of us carries within our heart, not a place of silencing, not a place of a toxic silence, but a place of that where we are available to that still small voice. And so, on the surface, my book, might look like it's just another spiritual self-help kind of a book, the mystical path to a joyful life. But I did try to, widen the conversation to indicate that spiritual self-care really is about equipping ourselves to, to use traditional language, to build the kingdom, to create the beloved community, to work for justice, to work for the dismantling of privilege and the creation of a society that more truly reflects the blessings of Christ and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So it is a book of spiritual nurture, but hopefully a book that doesn't just see spiritual nurture as the flight of the alone to the alone, but rather as kind of a breathing in, breathing out dynamic that we nurture ourselves so that we in turn are equipped to be of service.
Wow. Well, Carl, yours is the most recent of any of our books to come out. How's it gone in terms of the launch? Is the pandemic still preventing you from doing the typical book tour kinds of things or not?
Life is very different than it was the last time I had a book launch, and everything is online. I actually had an in-person event in August, and then I got a positive diagnosis.
Oh no!
So so I had to cancel that. I am vaccinated, so it never got worse than the sniffles. But obviously, I had to do the responsible thing. So I had to cancel the event. The event presenters were very gracious and they had me, Zoom in. So everybody was gathered at the monastery, and there I was like the Wizard of Oz, this big head, talking to them. But so I actually have another in-person event scheduled for the first weekend in November. So, maybe I'll actually be able to do that one. But, people ask me all the time, how's the book doing? And that's one of the challenges of being, kind of still working primarily out of my office is I don't know, I get a lot of orders on my own website. So I guess that's a good sign, but it's, this is an interesting age. And I think we're we're in this time of reinvention. I think COVID is going to change things for all of us in many, many ways. I anticipate that my work, my ministry going forward is going to have a much stronger online presence, much less of a traveling and speaking in public. I don't think that'll go away altogether. But I think that, that we are trying to reinvent how we do community. And, so we'll see. How's that for a non-answer?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I feel the same way, Carl. I mean, I come from a high-tech background. So before this whole pandemic thing, I was always asking myself, why aren't people doing more webinars? Why aren't, more things happening online, right? Because it breaks down the geographic barriers. It decreases the cost. It makes it easier to include more people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, since the pandemic, everyone's gotten comfortable with using, Zoom or something similar. And the technology is much better than it used to be. And I think that, going forward, this is really going to be much more common.
The only thing I would also like to add, though, Brian, is that I think we have to be really careful about the creation of digital haves and digital have-nots.
Sure.
And so, so if, and that for no other reason really makes me feel like, the calling together of community and the ability for people to meet in person must continue to be a priority for people of faith. So,
I mean, no question about that, right? But, it's like traveling is expensive too, right? So to do in-person event, at least, I do writers conferences, right? Before the pandemic, I did them in various cities all over the country. But if you want to attend it and you don't live in that city, you've got to travel. You've got to pay for a hotel or find somebody to stay with or, whatever, right? It's just not easy and it's expensive. So I hear what you're saying, but there's not just a digital divide, there's an economic divide and time availability divide, that a lot of folks don't have either one of those to do in-person events either. So, there's trade-offs on every dimension, that we can communicate with, but anyway. But Carl, I have to say that you definitely have the coolest shirt. I don't know if you're at the coolest table, but you definitely have the coolest shirt. So thank you for wearing that tonight.
My wife is an ice dyer, so that's one of her creations. So.
All right. So next I'd like to kind of get in for you folks to be able to share what else you're reading, of folks that, of other people's books, right, that have been particularly inspiring to you lately. So let's go in the same order. Angela, what are you reading?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of the typical, author who is in the middle of like maybe 15 books at the same time, and I'm constantly, reading online, and I subscribe to the LA Times and the Washington Post. So those are my daily reads. And then I've really been enjoying Liz Lenz's newsletter lately. She has a new book coming out soon. She writes a lot sort of at the intersection of politics, gender, and religion. So I really enjoy her. I read Culture Study by Helen Peterson. Lots of good stuff there. I'm also the mom of two young boys, so I'm trying to navigate, parenting in the middle of a pandemic and household roles and what those mean as a woman in a male-dominated field. So I found a lot of depth there. The book that I wanted to make sure to mention too, I wrote this down, so I've been reading, I think I'm the furthest along in Tomorrow Will Be Better, which is by Betty Smith, who is the author of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and sort of, that quintessential sort of striving tale of 20th century white immigrants to Brooklyn. But her second book that sort of recently resurfaced, that's become popular again, is the same protagonist from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, but it's her as a young woman and in her first marriage. And it's a much more cynical look at the American dream per se. I'm very interested in the ways that the American dream has historically left many people out. So that book has been a really good read. I'm still in the middle of it in the midst of all my other reading. But I appreciate, my own journey too. From when Red State Christians first came out, I still had a a great deal of hope for what dialogue, what relationship could do, what the local church could do. And I've definitely become more cynical in the last few years. So it's been a good read for me.
Good, thank you. Jennifer, how about you?
So one of the things that I'm focusing on right now is really looking at some of the harmful stereotypes and some of the harmful expectations that were put on Black women and that are sometimes put on women in general. And I'm reading books that fit into that. And so if you talk to most Black women and, some Black girls, they will tell you that they've been told that they need to work twice as hard, that they need to please the people around them. They need to put their will to the side in service of other people. And as I'm walking through that journey myself, I'm looking for authors who speak to that. And so right now, one of the books that I'm reading is Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And it's by Nedra Glover Tawwab. And then I'm also reading You Don't Know Anyone, You Don't Owe Anyone by Carolyn Garnett McGraw. And that's a broadleaf. It was published by Broadleaf. And one of the reasons those books are so important is because I feel like a lot of growing up is unlearning what we've learned when we were coming up and unpacking. And, I'm looking for works that affirm some of the messages that need to be unlearned and some of the things that need to be learned. So I'm really enjoying those. The other thing that I'm doing is that I think it's so important to invest in marginalized writers and marginalized authors or authors who come from marginalized communities. And so I'll just buy books just to support the authors. And at some point I'll get around to reading all of them. But these are the things that I'm really spending time with. And quite frankly, it is not only assisting in unlearning, but it's feeding, these things are feeding my spirit.
Wonderful, wonderful. Carl, what about you? What's been on your latest reading list?
Well, I'll be tipping my hand about my next book, but which I'm happy to do.
We'll talk about that in a minute. So hold that.
Well, I'll just tell the books, and then maybe people can get some
sure.
hints.
We'll guess for now. You can tell us later.
And actually, people might be surprised. Well, the two that I really want to mention that have just made such an impact on me are Lindo Tatro-Herzer's The Bible and the Transgender Experience, and Austen Hartke's Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. And so transgender theology is not something that I have a lot of knowledge. So this was kind of a new conversation. Obviously, I've done some work like reading Becoming Nicole, in terms of just my interest in the transgender experience as somebody who is not trans. But these books really connected some dots about, looking at scripture through kind of a transgender lens. So they were just really, again, impactful in terms of my own relationship with scripture, which I certainly have a troubled relationship with scripture like so many Christians do. I also just have to mention T.J. Klune's The House in the Cerulean Sea. I have my guilty pleasure is young adult novels. And that book is it's just a deliciously wonderful. It's funny and it's warm. It's queer affirming. It's just a 5-star book from beginning to end. So I really would endorse that. And then finally, I'll just mention, I also have a ministry as a spiritual director. So Janet Ruffing's To Tell the Sacred Tale, which is a book about narrative and spiritual direction, which sounds like a very narrow topic, but reading it as a writer, I really saw it as a book about narrative theology. And I think that's where, the excitement in theology is, thinking about, Jennifer talking about the experience of Black women, the power of really any person, a Black woman, a queer person, a trans person, anybody who traditionally maybe has not had access to the table where discourse is taking place. It's their narrative that is so, so important. And especially for somebody like me, for a white male, it is so important for me to receive that narrative. So narrative theology is very, very important to me. And that book has been very helpful in that respect.
So To Tell the Sacred Tale, that was the name of that last one, Carl?
By Janet Ruffing. Yes. And like I said, it's a book about narrative, the use of narrative and spiritual direction.
That sounds like something that I need to look into for writing for your life. That probably would be really applicable for that audience. So I need to do that. So Laura had a request. Can people write their book titles and authors in the chat? Which would really be wonderful if you wouldn't mind doing that. After each one of these webinars, I've been trying to go back and write down all the books that the people have mentioned, and for the first two, I was successful in doing that, but I haven't been able to do that for the third one yet because there were so many. So I had to go back and do that. So if you all, when you have a chance, when you're not answering a question, if you could go back and type in the books that you mentioned, that would really be wonderful. So I've got 3 different books I wanted to mention tonight. Through the other seminars, I've been doing other books, but here's one called Black and White. The subtitle is Disrupting Racism One Friendship at a Time. So, I've been reading a lot about anti-racism and how do we get ourselves, to address these issues. But, it's always struck me that this is such a grassroots kind of an issue. It's got to be solved at the local level. It's not something that we're going to solve, over the internet, right? Or whatever other mechanism that we might have. So that's a really good one. This one, The Upswing by Robert Putnam, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. So he's a historian, kind of writing and talking about the similarities of, different things, different stages America's been in before. And, what happened then that kind of caused greater cohesiveness. So that's the second one. The third one, this just arrived in the mail the other day. Twas the Season of Advent. So many of you know that I also do Christian children's book conferences, and Glennis Nellist has been the speaker, one of the speakers at all of the conferences that I've done. There's another one coming up next week. This is her latest book for this year, and it's just so beautiful. I won't, show you all the illustrations and everything, but it's just really a gorgeous book. So I wanted to make sure that I talked about that. And Angela mentioned Lenny Duncan. He's been with us previously on, our book launch interviews too, and he's written a couple of really excellent books. So I can certainly relate to that. Okay, so moving on. One of the things that I wanted to try to accomplish with this webinar series is to talk about like really big issues. So we've got way too many, right? We've got too many things right now that are big issues that look like intractable problems at one level. I'd love for each of you to share a little bit about, what you feel are the issues or issue that we really need to pay the most attention to now, and what do we do about it? So again, Angela, if you could start off on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, man, I drew the short straw tonight, huh? I like to.
Sorry, I'm just trying to do the rotation with
I'm
alphabetical
kidding.
order, so you win.
We're good. No,
your last name's not Elaine. I always got called on first. And my first name is Brian, right? So, I was at the top of the alphabet, good or bad.
That's true. No, I always hear when my colleagues or panelists are speaking, I always hear, "Oh shoot, I wanted to say that too." So that's all right. No, I was looking at this question tonight, and for me, I often view the world through the lens, both of as a pastor, as someone who is actively serving in a Christian community and trying to understand what Christian community can and should look like at this time in our history, and then also I see it through lens of as a journalist. And so the overlap between those two that I think is important for us to focus in on is just understanding truth and how we talk about truth when it comes to religion, when it comes to Christianity, when it comes to vaccines, when it comes to arguments, when it comes to politics. There has certainly been diminution of the understanding of does truth exist? Can we say something is true? And of course, we can get into a whole philosophical debate about postmodernism and what truth is. But I, as a Christian and as a theologian, I think that truth is often rooted in narratives, and the narratives that we tell ourselves, the narratives that we grow up with. And I certainly see the ways that my congregation here in the rural Midwest is shaped by the narratives of their lives, in contrast to the narratives that have shaped the lives of my urban neighbors where I live in Minneapolis, who have come from other parts of the world, other parts of the country. So what I think is really important for Christians and for those of us who care about Christian community is to look at how we can regain some control or some agency over the narratives that are shaping our country right now. Because right now our narratives are being written by algorithms that are grounded in profit. And so the profit motive has shaped so much of the ways that we understand ourselves as Americans, and even the ways that Christians understand ourselves. So I think it's really important, to go back to a lot of basics. And before we get into all these major issues of racism, sexism, poverty, economic injustice, abortion, capital punishment, all things that are representative of the evil in our world today, I think that we need to break down the narratives that people are understanding, the ways that truth has been diminished, and reclaim a space to say, you have your opinion, I have my opinion, but there is a truth somewhere out there that we are going to have to come to. And things cannot be equal without looking at that central truth. So I think that's the most important thing for me, is getting back to acknowledgement of truth and truth's grounding in the central narratives that we teach one another, and going from there. I mean, like I said, I've gotten more cynical over the last few years, and I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've been doing it in communities that have been decimated by misinformation, communities that have been decimated by hatred. So I think we really have to get back to basics. And before we say how divided we are, or before we define ourselves according to terms like liberal or conservative, we actually have to define what those terms mean today. Because what once passed for conservative has been replaced by an ideology that is much more grounded in authoritarianism than it is in traditional conservatism.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Very powerful. And I hate to ask this question, but what do you see as the mechanisms to deal with reestablishing truth?
Well, as when I put on my journalist hat, I think that, there's some important work being done by some nonprofits, places like ProPublica, places that are trying to fund journalism that is rooted in something other than a profit motive. Even, mainstream media sources have been sort of compromised by their having to adhere to a profit motive. So I think some of that nonprofit supported journalism is really important. I think we also have to look at, I went to journalism school. I went to the University of Missouri, which is a very good journalism school. But as I came up in journalism, and as I worked for newspapers, and as I've continued to work in journalism, I've noticed how part of the critique that often comes from the right, which is, I don't think this is a right-left critique, but part of the critique is that so much of American media comes from the same elite social circles that make up much of power in America. And so I think that's something that we have to look at as well, is the ability of journalists and of media outlets to tell stories from the perspective of people that are marginalized, and not to continue to sort of fall into the same old stories every time. And I didn't mention, but I subscribe to another newsletter that sort of breaks down, Heather Cox Richardson, her newsletter is very important in breaking down sort of how we often sort of tell the same story about, the media tries to set themselves in the middle, and this is what the Republicans think, this is what the Democrats think, when we're actually in a situation when we have, half of our political leaders actively seeking to kind of destroy the government. So you can't tell those same old stories every time. And I think pointing out, Margaret Sullivan is another media columnist for the Washington Post who often points out the ways in which our old narratives are no longer sufficient.
Thank you, Angela. Very important, very powerful. Jen, how about you?
I think that some of the issues that keep me up and that I think about a ton are justice issues, climate justice, racial justice, reproductive justice. And my concern with all these issues is that the same communities that are impacted by the climate crisis are also the same communities that are adversely impacted by attacks on voting rights, by attacks on reproductive rights. And so it's the same communities that are being hit over and over and over and over again. The one exception is, climate justice, it impacts all of us, but it's the frontline communities that bear the disproportionate toll. They are least likely, or they emit the smallest, they have the smallest footprint, but they pay the heaviest toll. And this was driven home for me recently after Hurricane Ida. And I thought about coastal Mississippi and also Louisiana. They've been hit over and over again, but these communities still have not recovered from the trauma of COVID-19. They're still grappling. And so I feel that, on the one hand, I feel that if we're not careful, these kind of issues and these concerns can drive us into our own, to stay with our own. And I think that as people of faith, we have to resist that tendency, and we have to really do as the Bible commanded and mourn with those who mourn and celebrate with those who celebrate. But one of the things that really disturbs me is that I sometimes feel the people who we elect, not enough of them feel the urgency and are willing to sacrifice all to address these kinds of issues. I feel like sometimes the church is too passive in addressing these kinds of issues. We're at a critical stage, and when you're at a critical stage, the incrementalism that maybe you would have deployed at an earlier phase, it does not work. And so I'm very, very concerned, and I am quite frankly afraid, because while some of us can weather different storms better than others, we've been asking marginalized communities to bear a lot and to be resilient in the face of trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma. And there is a breaking point. And I want to see more action from the church around these issues. I want the community to look to the church in a way that I don't know that we're really doing now.
Thank you. Carl.
I'm so tempted to kind of take a page from Angela and say, well, what they said. But I heard Angela speak so beautifully about truth, and then Jennifer speak so eloquently about justice. And so as I was listening to the two of you, I was thinking about a book that I first read a little while ago, and then a conversation I had with an Episcopal priest about 25 years ago. So I'll start with the priest, and that was a man named Zippo Mizamela. And Zippo eventually became a member of Nelson Mandela's cabinet. He was from South Africa. He was here in the United States because he was a wanted man in South Africa during the apartheid regime. If he had gone back, he would have just gone straight to jail and probably would have ended up, the fate of Stephen Biko or someone like that. But after Nelson Mandela was elected, Zippo was apparently highly placed politically in South Africa, ended up being in Nelson Mandela's cabinet. Zippo married my wife and me. He was the priest who officiated at our marriage. And when, so we got to know him over our, marriage journey. And I remember so clearly, we were having a conversation one time. I don't remember the specifics, but, the news cycle had been about violence in South Africa. And like I say, you got to remember this is while apartheid is still happening. And I said to Zippo, living as an Episcopal priest in Atlanta, obviously far, far away from the land that he loved, I said, what's the path forward for South Africa? And his answer really surprised me. He said, there must be hope. He said, we have to find a way to give hope to everyone, Black and white, across the spectrum, because it is the absence of hope that is leading to the violence and that has created the tinderbox that we are exhibiting. And so that has just stayed with me for so long. And then the book I want to mention is Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, which, as you all may know, was the book that Martin Luther King Jr. carried with him at all times. It was found in his briefcase after he was murdered. And, and Thurman, of course, is writing in the 1940s. And it's difficult to read that book because it's just a reminder. And again, speaking as a white person, but to read that and to see, we've come so little in such a long time. And to really feel the burden of history and the burden of the persistence of racial injustice in our country. But Thurman, who is absolutely clear-headed and unstinting in his critique of Jim Crow racism, the racism of the 1940s, did such an amazing job at speaking about the necessity of dismantling racism from that perspective of, Christian hope. I mean, he was a Baptist minister, so certainly out of his faith journey. And so it seems to me that hope is what we need to do the hard work that we need to do. Any of the issues that have been mentioned tonight are issues that many people find themselves simply overwhelmed by. And, again, speaking as a white male, the reality is that white males and anybody else who is the beneficiary of social privilege, we have to dismantle privilege, and we have to take the lead in being dismantlers of privilege. And many of us are frightened about that. We are overwhelmed by that. We do not even know the first step to take. And we understand that people who have been denied privilege are not the people who should be teaching us. We have to figure this out. We created the mess. We have to uncreate it. So we need hope. The people who have been hurt, the people who have been traumatized, the people who have been who have borne the brunt of injustice need hope so that they can continue to lead. They are the people who must lead as we all partner together to create a truly just society. So again, following Angela, let's start with the basics. Yes, we need truth. Yes, we need a commitment to justice, and we need the hope to help us to see that fight through. So.
Wow. Thank you for that. Let me ask you the same question that I asked Angela a moment ago. What are the mechanisms by which we grow hope?
Well, narrative has come up a lot in this conversation, and I think we have to find a way to hear everyone's story. And those of us who are maybe more accustomed to being able to tell our stories and maybe haven't been as accustomed to listen, we need to listen. We have got to listen to the stories of people who have not historically had the opportunity to have their stories heard. So
how do we make that, from just real pragmatic scale? I agree with you 100%. How do we make it happen?
Well, like I can tell you, Encountering Silence, and we're just a tiny little podcast, but we really do try to make sure that we foreground voices of people of color, queer voices, women before men. We all have to look at ways that we can make a difference, even if it's a small difference, because a lot of small differences will add up to one big difference. So I think, it's a lie to say I have no power or I have no authority. We all have to look at how can I make a difference? I live in Clarkston, Georgia, which is a refugee settlement community, one of the most ethnically diverse communities, not only in the state of Georgia, but really in North America. And so, this is, the thing that I have to look at. Am I forming relationships with the refugee people who are my neighbors? And that's probably true of many of us. Who are our neighbors who are different from us? Can we find a way to reach out to them? And that's hard. It's hard work. This is not easy work, but it's vital work. And hopefully, churches are taking the lead. I know every congregation is different in terms of how it is meeting the needs of this moment. But, I mean, if your church ain't doing it, maybe the church 2 blocks down is, and sometimes we have to vote with our feet. But I think we have to start small, but do the work we're called to do.
I mean, that's the way it strikes me. It has to be universal. I mean, it has to be grassroots, has to be everywhere. So the next question has to do with kind of, the bipolarization of the political sphere that we have and the overlap of that political sphere with the religious sphere. So, there's, I'm going to use stereotypical words, I know, but, there's progressive Christians and there are conservative or fundamentalist, Christians. And there's part of me that says, does that matter? Should we do anything about it? And there's, the other part of me says, well, of course we have to do something about it. But I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on that. And maybe this time, Jennifer, you want to go first?
Sure. So I sometimes struggle with labels. Labels are a good way to help us identify different folks. But I think that if we're not careful, labels can also be a way to allow us to think that we are farther along than we are. And sometimes I think that just by saying, oh, I'm, a progressive Christian or I'm liberal, that we give ourselves points that maybe our work has not earned. The bigger question for me is, are we all doing our individual work? Carl, I so love what you said, because I think that, if we get to a place where we're hopeless, we just check out and we just say, it is what it is. I can't impact it. But I think that there's something that we can each do. And I think that our journey exists as long as we're here on earth, regardless of what we call ourselves. I can say that, I'm a social justice author and communicator, but that means that I also have to be doing my work. Even as a Black woman, there are areas in which I have blind spots. There are areas in which I'm privileged. And so my work continues. All of our work continues. I feel like one of the biggest myths and where we get in trouble is we think that just by calling ourselves a Christian, that absolves ourselves of the work that we need to do, or that we somehow can't be racist, somehow can't be sexist, but we contribute to all of that regardless of the label that we carry. And so part of what we're supposed to be doing is unpacking it regardless of what we call ourselves.
Thank you. Carl, how about you?
Well, so how do we bridge the divide? Is that the question?
Yeah, basically.
Well, I think we have to find some way to listen, but also to tell the truth. Back to Angela's comment about the truth matters, and that our own truth matters. I live in Georgia, and even though Georgia went blue the last election, it was by a razor thin margin. Georgia has historically been a red state. And so I know many people, that are in my life, who do not think the way I do not vote the way I do. And it's, especially in this day and age when as soon as you get onto social media, I can't remember which of you mentioned the algorithm of profit. But, that's what social media is. And we immediately get channeled into, situations. And what I really have to watch out for is when I'm delivered up content that shames or makes fun of the people who don't think or vote like I do. And I'm very suspicious of content like that. I don't think content like that is helpful. It's content that is designed to make me feel good about myself. I'm better than those blankety blank fundamentalists, or those blankety blank Trumpites, or those blankety blank straight white male privilege types, etc. And I think we have to meet that temptation with a dose of humility. And Jennifer's comment that there's a level on which many of us have some measure of privilege. Many of us have have opportunities that are denied to other people, or we are the beneficiaries of certain social or economic or, whatever kind of privileges that is at the expense of others. And we have to interrogate that. And it's hard work. It's not easy work, but it's vital work and it's important work. And if we can find a way to do it together, then it has to happen. I think it is instructive to remember that political division has always been with us. So it's not like we're going to make these divisions just go away. But I think we have to find some way where we can enter into the reality that there are different narratives, there are different philosophies, there are different viewpoints without knee-jerk demonizing the other. And I think, if everybody is demonizing me, then I have to stop demonizing them. It's easier for me to say that because of my educational background, my economic background, my status as a white person, et cetera. I understand that. Well, it's got to start somewhere. And, and so I think, any interaction, any political issue, any moment that arises, the question I guess we all have to ask, am I going to just give in to anger that not a healthy anger, a righteous anger, an anger that wants to reform and transform, but I'm talking about the anger that destroys, the anger that corrodes. Am I going to give in to that anger? Or am I going to give in to despair? Am I going to give in to kind of a bitter cynicism? Angela, you mentioned you're cynical. I just hope it's not a bitter cynicism. I think cynicism is like anything else. There's cynicism and there's cynicism. The bitter cynicism, I think, is the one that leads to inaction. All of this is a process. And so the question has to be, how are the choices I'm faced with today? How do they lead to something different tomorrow? A friend of mine who's a Trappist monk, he asks the question, am I giving birth to angels with my actions and with my words? And I think wherever we are in the cycle, whether we're people who've been traumatized, people who've been victimized, people who've been hurt, or we're just people who are the beneficiaries of privilege, wherever we are, that's the question we all have to ask. Are the choices I'm making today giving birth to angels? So.
Thank you, Carl. Angela, are you okay with hanging in there, or?
I'm okay. Yeah, I'm at 6%. So we'll see. I may jump on my phone in a minute.
Sure.
I see my church members coming in for our meeting tonight. But this work and this question has represented much of the work that I have attempted to do. And when my book first came out pre-pandemic, a lot of the places that I was doing events titled them Finding Hope in a Divided Country. Now, as I said, I've become a bit cynical since then. I just got my warning message, so I'll pop back on my phone if I go out. But I wanted to actually read a passage from the Bible real quick from Luke 12:49. And I think we have to keep this in mind when we talk about political division, particularly those of us in white mainline denominations that have often been guilty of the label of white moderate and have, with our voices, given assent to anti-racism, with our voices given assent to justice movements, but have continued to live pretty comfortably and not followed up our words with our actions. So we have maybe taken a label that we have not earned, as Jennifer had stated. So Luke 12:49, Jesus says, I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I've come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. So I think sometimes we have to realize that some of the work that Jesus does is the work of division. It is the work of dividing. Sometimes we're called to stand on a side. And maybe I'm preaching to myself here, but I think I'm preaching to a lot of white so-called liberal Christians. Is sometimes we are called to take a stand, and a stand that may be costly. And so I think, do we worry about the division in Christianity? I think where I worry about it is I've spent a lot of my life in spaces where it is just assumed that if you are Christian and you go to church, you're a Republican. That is just a taken for granted fact in a lot of America. And I think that is dangerous when a religion has become so overly identified with a political party. I think that's quite dangerous and speaks to the level with which Christianity in America has been entrenched into white Christian nationalism, because that narrative leaves out any Christians who are not white in a very profound way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Angela. So just to finish off, I wanted to end on a little bit lighter note for each of you to talk a little bit about what, your future work looks like. And I know you've touched on that a little bit, but Angela, since you're running out of time and power, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I'll give it quickly. So we have the new edition. I'm excited. Sounds like both Jennifer and I have our paperbacks coming out next fall. So looking forward to the new edition. We're moving from understanding the voters who elected Donald Trump, getting Trump's name off my cover, and into a journey into white Christian nationalism and the wreckage it leaves behind in the aftermath of COVID, George Floyd, and the insurrection. Also, I'm hard at work on a second book proposal, working with my agent to get it out there. But the working title is My Grandpa's Granddaughter, What Killed Him and Saved Me. My grandpa was a pastor working at the time of Vietnam, working at the time of civil rights, and he was driven out of churches. He died saying he would never set foot in the Lutheran church again. He died very much rejected by the American church, rejected by American Christianity, and deep in despair. And as his granddaughter, becoming a minister myself, I often have been ashamed to say, this was my grandpa, this was his life in ministry, because he did not have a great reputation. But what he did do was work very hard for justice. What he did do was speak out very powerfully. What he did do to the end of his life was continue to minister, continue to be deeply rooted in scripture, deeply rooted in the actual work of the gospel, of visiting, of caring for those who were without, of dwelling with the marginalized. So his legacy and his story has shaped a lot of my ministry, and has also, been real in my own rejection from certain Christian spaces, has been my own journey of disillusionment with the institutional church, my disillusionment with the white evangelical spaces that I once ministered in. So we're working on that. It's a labor of love, but
that really sounds amazing. So look forward to that.
Thank you so much for doing this. I'll hang on and try and listen to these guys before I run off to my council meeting, but I'm so glad to be with both of you and with you, Brian. So I look forward to reading more of your work, and thank you to everyone who joined us.
Thanks very much, Angela. Jennifer, how about you?
So making some edits to First and Only because it'll come out again in the fall of 2022. So that's where I am right now. That's the pressing thing. But my next book will focus on some of the struggles and triumphs of single mothers, and what mothering really means, what it has evolved to today in the American context, and also African Indigenous roots in terms of what it means to mother. So really, really excited about that, and hoping to spark a conversation about how we engage with single mothers and how we think about motherhood.
Wonderful. Well, we'll look forward to that. Thank you. Carl, how about you?
Well, I'm really excited. In fact, I think this is the first time I've publicly shared this, but I'm excited to say that Broadleaf has optioned my next book. The working titles can change, but the working title is How to Read the Bible Like a Mystic. And so you can see why I'm reading, I'm trying to get, different perspectives on scripture, reading womanist theology, queer theology, transgender theology, obviously just a variety of perspectives. But it's not just about, about all the voices around the table, as important as I believe that is. But it's also about trying to recover an imaginative while also critical approach to the text. And so, acknowledging that the important insights of historical critical scholarship and, the good work that biblical scholars have done over the past, certainly several hundred years, remains vital in terms of our ability to understand and enter into the text. But then also to kind of excavate some of the practices, and many of which have been revived in our time, Lectio Divina, Ignatian composition of place, those kinds of practices that are a little bit more spiritually oriented. And my argument is that a well-rounded scriptural diet really needs both. So we need the many voices that help us to read the text from a variety of perspectives. We also need the authority of our own hearts, and we need to bring that hope and bring that ability to dream into the text, while at the same time recognizing that the text will challenge us. Certainly, I'm going to argue that we need a post-fundamentalist narrative for how to read the text. We need to allow the Bible to sometimes set a bad example, and to be able to talk about that honestly. So I think it's going to be fun. I'm just at the beginning process. Probably we're looking at a 2024 pub date. So it'll be a while, but stay tuned. It should be coming out. So.
Well, good works take a long time to come to fruition. So that's understandable. So thank you, Carl and Jennifer and Angela, for joining us. And I look forward to, doing interviews with you about your new books. And thank you everyone else for participating in this and joining us. As I mentioned earlier, we'll have another series of webinars in January with an additional set of authors. And so we wish for you to stay tuned and join us that. Again, thanks everyone, and enjoy the best as you can the rest of the year. Take care.
Thank you.